Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. So as you saw from the title, there is a huge update in the case of Ana Walshe that came out just last week when I'm filming this video, and I think this update answered a lot of the questions that the public had about this case. And even though this case is still developing, it just happened at the beginning of this year, there's a lot of information about the case out there, and investigators just revealed what they believe to be the motive in her murder, which there was a lot of speculation about over the last couple of months. For those of you who haven't heard about this case before, I will go through the whole case in this video, but if you're just here for the update, I will leave timestamps in the description box below. But before we get into it, I just want to say if you like this video, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more true crime content. And if you haven't noticed, I got a new camera and a new mic, so if the video looks good or you have feedback, just let me know in the comment section below. So let's start off by talking about who Ana Walshe was. Ana was born on April 13th, 1983, and she was raised in Belgrade, Serbia. She lived in Serbia all the way through her education and then immigrated to the United States in 2005. And it seems like the majority of her family, including her parents, still live back in Serbia. She was described as a very hardworking person, and the successful career she was able to build for herself in America emulates that. Ana started her career out working in hospitality in Washington, and she worked her way up the corporate ladder, accepting positions at different companies across Washington, New York, and Massachusetts over the years. Ana married her first husband in 2007, and they ended up getting divorced in 2014. And then later that year, while Ana was working as a front office director at an upscale hotel in Boston, she started dating Brian Walshe, who was the son of a prominent neurologist, and Ana described their relationship as love at first sight. Brian and Ana ended up getting married at the end of 2015 at a church in Boston. The two then ended up buying a gorgeous home in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and then they went on to have their first son in 2016, then their second son in 2018, and their third son in 2020. And even though Ana was now the mother of 3 sons, she didn't slow down her career at all. She loved her job and really wanted to provide the best possible life that she could for her family. And then in 2022, Ana accepted a job as a real estate investment manager at the international property management company called Trishman Speyer. The only thing about this job was that it was actually located in Washington, D.C. So Ana would split her time between D.C., where she owned a townhome for her work, and Cohasset, where her husband and children lived. So she would basically live in DC during the work week and then fly back to Cohasset for the weekends to spend time with her family. To sum it up, Ana was a successful, hardworking, beautiful, and dedicated person with lots of friends and was close with her colleagues, as we can see from her many social media posts. Her husband, on the other hand, Brian Walshe, was a sketchy fuck. I don't know how else to describe him. He had a long history of criminal behavior, violence, conning people, stealing from friends and family, and at the time of Ana's death earlier this year, Brian was actually on house arrest. And this was because he pled guilty to federal fraud charges for selling fake Andy Warhol paintings on eBay. In 2016, less than a year after Ana and Brian had gotten married, Brian obtained 2 real Andy Warhol paintings, which he had taken from his friend. He did this by telling his friend that he could make him a lot of money by reselling the art. But as soon as his friend handed over the art, he never heard from Brian again. Brian photographed the real Andy Warhol paintings and posted them for sale with the authentication stamp on eBay for $100,000. An unlucky buyer ended up buying the paintings from Brian, and after the transaction was completed, he realized that the paintings that Brian had sold him looked different from the ones in the listing. And the authentication stamp, which should have been on the back of the paintings, was nowhere to be found. And this is because Brian knowingly switched out the real Andy Warhol paintings with fake replicas. The buyer confronted Brian about the fake paintings and tried to return them, and Brian actually strung him along for quite a bit, saying that he was going to pay him back in installments. But after months of not receiving any kind of refund, the buyer ended up getting the FBI involved. After a lengthy investigation, Brian was charged with wire fraud, interstate transportation of a scheme to defraud, possession of converted goods, and unlawful monetary transaction. Brian pled guilty to, I think, 3 of those charges in 2021 and was placed on house arrest while he was awaiting his sentencing. And something to note is that Brian's house arrest seemed pretty lenient. Like, he actually was allowed to leave the house and he didn't wear an ankle bracelet or anything. But if he wanted to go somewhere, he would have to request it in advance and give the specific locations and times. He may have received a more lenient house arrest situation because Ana actually wrote a letter to the US District Judge in 2021 asking for leniency in his sentencing, explaining that he is a loving husband and doting father. Brian was likely going to be sentenced to years of jail time and hefty fines, but his sentencing was stalled because prosecutors learned that this was not the first time Brian had done something like this. They discovered that a few years before the art fraud, Brian had actually plundered the estate of his father, Thomas Walshe. Brian and his father, who was a neurologist, had a major falling out a decade before the art fraud because Brian had swindled him out of $1 million in a real estate scheme. And because of this, Brian and his father were completely estranged, and Brian's father wrote him out of his will. Specifically, he wrote, "My best wishes, but nothing else from my estate," to Brian in his will. But when Thomas Walshe died, Brian destroyed his will, drained all his bank accounts, and began selling off his assets. Luckily, some of Thomas's friends got involved and entered a legal dispute with Brian, and it was ruled that Brian was not entitled to anything from his father's estate. There were actually many other things that Brian did like this throughout his life, but I think you get the picture of what kind of person he was. It looked like he didn't want to work hard for anything in his life, and he would rather just con and steal from people, which is the exact opposite of who Ana was, and I'm really surprised they were a couple. I don't see how they had anything in common, honestly. Brian hadn't achieved much in his life. In fact, he was a college dropout, while Ana graduated from the University of Belgrade before earning her master's at Cornell University. Supposedly, Brian contributed very little to the finances, and Ana was covering all of the household bills. And it's unclear what, if any, legitimate work he did during their marriage. In fact, on his LinkedIn page, he lists that he is the CFOs for a bunch of different organizations that don't appear to have websites. He also didn't have any friends of his own that were able to say anything good about him. In fact, one of his father's friends said that he was a sociopath and a very violent person. I'm just speculating here, but I think what could have happened is Brian conned Ana into thinking that he was as successful as she was, and she had already fallen in love with him when she realized the truth. And it seems like the cracks started to appear pretty early on in their relationship, as Ana reportedly called the police on Brian in 2014 for threatening to kill her and her friends. But the case was closed because Ana refused to cooperate, according to the police report. So now let's talk about the tragic events that took place earlier this year. As we talked about before, Ana was splitting her time between Washington, D.C. and Cohasset. And she flew home to Cohasset on December 30th to spend the holiday weekend with her family, and she wasn't expected to return back to D.C. until January 3rd. On New Year's Eve, Ana and Brian decided to just stay home with their kids, and they invited one of Ana's friends over to ring in the new year. Ana's friends said they had a really nice time. They drank champagne, and they each signed the outside of a champagne bottle saying that 2023 was going to be their best year ever. He said nothing seemed out of the ordinary between the couple, and he stayed at their home until 1:30 a.m. that night.
Brian had cooked an elaborate meal for us, and we hugged and celebrated and toasted, and just what you do over New Year's, and there was a lot of looking forward to the new year.
And no one realized that anything was wrong until January 4th, 2023, when Ana didn't show up for work in DC. A lot of her colleagues were immediately concerned because they actually hadn't heard from her since New Year's Eve, and she wasn't responding to any texts or calls. Her firm promptly called the Cohasset police and reported that she didn't show up for work, and they were concerned for her safety. So the Cohasset police visited Ana's home to do a well-being check, and that's when Brian answered the door and explained to them that he hadn't seen Ana in 3 days. So a missing persons report was filed for Ana later that day on January 4th, and right away the police started questioning Brian about when the last time he saw her was and what his whereabouts were over the last couple of days. And Brian was very cooperative and seemed pretty concerned about his wife. So now let's go over what timeline Brian gave police. Brian claimed that on New Year's Eve, Ana got an emergency call from her work, and she found out that she would have to fly back to DC on January 1st, which was days earlier than originally planned. He said the next morning she got up, got ready quickly, kissed him goodbye, and told him to go back to sleep. Then he said she took an Uber or Lyft to the airport like she always did around 6 or 7 a.m. that morning, and that was the last time he saw her. Brian said later that day on January 1st, a babysitter arrived in the afternoon, and he left home to go get groceries around 3 p.m. He told police he then went to see his mother around 4 p.m. in Swampscott, which is an hour drive from Cohasset, but that he left his cell phone at home, so he got lost on the way there without any directions, which made the trip longer than usual. He said he left his mother's home within 15 minutes of arriving to run errands for her at Whole Foods and CVS. Brian told police he returned to Cohasset around 8 p.m. that night. Then the next day, on January 2nd, Brian told investigators that he took one of his children for ice cream at a juice bar in Norwell. And he said that was the only time he left the house on January 2nd, and that he didn't leave the house at all on January 3rd. He also reported that on January 4th, before the police showed up to do the wellness check, he had been calling Ana's friends and her work to see if anyone had heard from her because she hadn't been in touch with him for a couple of days. Investigators later confirmed that he did make these calls. So then investigators jumped into action right away and launched a missing persons operation to try to find Ana. They announced her disappearance to the public and asked that anyone with information to please come forward. One of the first things police looked into was Ana's cell phone data, and they found that her cell phone had pinged in the area of their Cohasset home on January 1st and 2nd, which was immediately alarming to police because this completely contradicts Brian's story, which was that Ana left in the early morning hours of January 1st. The cell phone data showed that Ana's phone was stationary all the way from the morning of January 1st to 3 a.m. on January 2nd, when it was then turned off. So the focus of the search and rescue operation, which included K9 units, quickly became the wooded areas near their home.
Another long day of trekking through the thick wooded area near Ana Walshe's home.
They are searching 2 other sectors today, and they are also using police canines. So that is really all that I can release at this time.
Cohasset police staying tight-lipped with updates. State police confirming they drained the Walshes' backyard pool and searched a nearby stream. They found nothing.
It's not normal that she's missing, so we automatically feel that she's in danger by the mere fact that she's missing.
But the cell phone data also made investigators pretty suspicious of Brian, so they began to try to corroborate his whereabouts. And that's when they discovered that Brian had completely lied about what he was doing during the first couple days of January. Starting with January 1st, police couldn't find any proof or indication that an Uber or Lyft had picked up Ana from their home. And if you remember, Brian told investigators that he ran errands for his mom at Whole Foods and CVS, but investigators couldn't find any security footage or receipts that placed him at either of those stores. Then the next day, on January 2nd, Brian claimed he took his son to get ice cream, and then after that, didn't leave the house again. Security footage proves that he did take his son to get ice cream, but turns out he made another stop that day that he didn't report to police. Surveillance footage placed Brian Walshe at a Home Depot in Rockland wearing a surgical mask and gloves. There he bought $450 of cleaning supplies, including mops, a bucket, tarps, goggles, a hatchet, and baking soda. And he paid for all these items in cash. So police started to really narrow in on Brian, and on January 8th, Brian Walshe was arrested and charged with misleading a police investigation because he had lied about his whereabouts, and the majority of the trips he took disobeyed his house arrest order. Brian pled not guilty to the charge of misleading the police, and the judge set bail at $500,000. Later that day, on January 8th, the police obtained a search warrant for the Walshes' home, and that's when they found blood and a bloody knife in their basement. In the days after Brian's arrest, police continued to search for evidence and any sign of Ana. They uncovered a lot of evidence and were able to put together a really good picture of what Brian Walshe was doing during those first few days of January. I won't list out all the evidence that they found because it's quite a lot, but let's talk about the most incriminating discoveries that came to light after his arrest. So first off, investigators ended up finding Brian on even more surveillance footage buying suspicious items. He visited a Lowe's, TJ Maxx, and Home Goods, store trips he didn't disclose to police or his parole officer. He is seen purchasing a couple 5-gallon buckets, a hacksaw, terry cloth towels, a full coverage suit, 200 disposable rags, trash bags, and other cleaning products. Then investigators ended up searching a trash transfer station in Peabody, Massachusetts. They searched for days, combing through mountains of trash, and ended up finding some very suspicious and disturbing evidence, including a hacksaw, bloodstained clothes and rugs, Ana's COVID vaccination card, and some of her designer belongings. These items were immediately sent for testing. Then through more surveillance video, police tracked Brian and his car visiting various dumpsters in Abington and Brockton, disposing of heavy black garbage bags on January 3rd. And police believe that Ana's dismembered remains are in those black garbage bags. And before police even knew that Ana was missing, those dumpsters were emptied and taken to be incinerated. So it is very unlikely that Ana's remains will ever be recovered, which is just heartbreaking. She was a 39-year-old mother of 3 sons, and this selfish monster took her away from her friends and family.
Give me a bit of a feel for the girl that you knew, the colleague that you knew, what she talked about when she talked about her family.
Absolutely. I mean, her boys were everything. Absolutely everything to her. She was driven. She was the super mom. She was a super radiant spirit. I mean, walk into a room, you feel her energy. She's either dancing, smiling, laughing. I mean, that's Ana. So it's very hard for me to see that in a past tense. So I just say that she is, her spirit still remains.
It's hard to hear this news today because up until today, there was hope.
Then, based on other cell phone data, police believe that Brian disposed of other evidence in Cohasset and Swampscott, where his mother lived, on January 4th and 5th. And then that evidence was discovered at the Peabody trash transfer site that we talked about before. Prosecutors allege that Brian was able to get rid of Ana's body before police even knew that she was missing, but he lied to police about his whereabouts to buy himself time to clean up the crime scene and get rid of more evidence. Now, the last piece of evidence that I want to talk about are the Google searches that Brian Walshe made in the first few days of January, and it doesn't get more shocking and incriminating than this. On December 27th, Brian Walshe Googled on his son's iPad, "What's the best state to divorce for a man?" And we'll come back to the context on that one later. Then on January 1st at 4:55 a.m., which is when police believed he had already killed Ana, "How long before a body starts to smell?" 10 ways to dispose of a body if you really need to. How long for someone to be missing to inherit? And how to clean blood from wooden floor. And then just after noon on January 2nd, Brian made several more Google searches. And just a warning, these are very upsetting. Hacksaw, best tool to dismember. Can you be charged with murder without a body? And can you identify a body with broken teeth? He had many more disturbing and incriminating searches, but you get the gist. Then, with all that evidence, Brian Walshe was charged with the murder of his wife on January 17th, 2023. He pled not guilty, not sure what he thinks is going to happen. He's really just such an idiot, which is good in terms of justice for Ana and the prosecution's case, but yeah, he really did himself in with those Google searches. He's just lazy in every aspect of life, apparently. Another thing I wanted to touch on is that there was a lot of concern within the community about what would happen to Ana's 3 sons. They are only 2, 4, and 6, and they just lost both of their parents. And we don't really know what they heard or saw on New Year's Eve or the following days, and it's just heartbreaking. The most recent update that I could find is that they're currently under state custody.
First, let's talk about the process. What does it mean when we hear at this early stage they are in state custody? What kind of state custody? What kind of bed? What kind of mommy figure?
So that's a great question, Ashley, and we can't totally answer that. But what we want to keep our mind on is the state custody means they have to take over and have the actual responsibility of having these kids. They could be in a home, they could be in a specialized foster home where the parents have gone through trauma therapy training and they are used to taking something like this. We just don't know. And it makes sense from a legal perspective that, especially with this investigation still going on and the grandmother now involved or the paternal grandmother now involved at some level, that legally the only people that can be held responsible for these kids is the state of Massachusetts. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're in a bad place or in a bad home, but it means the state is protecting them. and they will make the decisions on what happens to the children.
But Ana's friends are working to get the state to allow the boys to go with one of Ana's friends. But above all else, they just want the boys to stay together if they are placed into a different home through the system.
Okay, the big question everybody has when they see all these pictures have all 3 little boys in them, right? There's rarely a picture without all 3 of those little guys. Look at them, they're so cute. They even dress the same. Please tell me they don't get split up, especially in these early days. Just they would keep all 3 together because they are the only family now that they have.
They will make every effort to keep all 3 together. That is, all family law is based on that. Anytime you go into a foster care system or any kind of custody like this, the research tells us, family law tells us, we try to keep them all together and with some kind of biological attachment. So the only time they might get separated is if there is a care need, like a disability or some special need that is too much for one family to take, or if there isn't a family that can take all 3. And sometimes states are overwhelmed and don't have someone who can take all 3.
My heart really goes out to these children, and I really hope that they get what's best for them. So this case gained a lot of attention because there were so many details that were released, and we were able to get a really good picture of how everything went down. But what we didn't really have answers on was what the motive was in this murder. Brian Walshe is a monster, and I think it's pretty clear he doesn't care about anyone else other than himself, especially when it came to financial gain. He screwed his friends and family over for financial gain, so this led a lot of people to speculate that he probably did the same thing to Ana. And people started to believe this even more when the details about Ana's real estate portfolio were made public. Turns out Ana had a substantial real estate portfolio. She owned properties in Washington, Maryland, and Massachusetts. I've seen a couple estimated values out there, but let's just say it was at least valued at over $2 million. And her townhome in Washington, D.C., where she stayed at while she was working there, was worth $1.3 million alone, so that gives you a good idea. Investigators also learned that Brian would likely inherit these assets if something happened to Ana. Another motive that came up as a possibility was that Brian was just possessive of Ana, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before he was going to be sentenced to jail for the art fraud, and he didn't want Ana to be with anyone else while he was in jail. But that was just purely speculation. But all of these questions got answered on April 27th when police revealed what they believed to be the motive in Ana's murder. It turns out Ana was actually having an affair with a man from Washington, D.C. when she went missing earlier this year, and that Brian found out about it. The man's name has not been released to the public, just FYI. According to investigators, Ana had spent Thanksgiving in Ireland with this man, and when they met with him, he confirmed that he had been dating Ana for several months and that they had spent Christmas Eve together. He said they also planned to celebrate New Year's when she returned to DC from Massachusetts on January 3rd. This man was also Ana's most frequently called cell phone contact, according to cell phone data. Police believe that Brian Walshe began to suspect that his wife was having an affair in January 2022. And this was because he routinely visited the Instagram page of one of her male friends. And on December 26th, his mother, with his input and direction, obtained and hired a private investigator to surveil Ana in Washington, D.C. And then it's believed that the PI confirmed Brian's suspicions on December 27th, and that's why he Googled what's the best date for a divorce for a man. Then, according to one of Ana's friends, on December 28th, while she was having dinner with Ana in DC, Ana became uncharacteristically upset and told her friend she believed Brian was going to be incarcerated as a result of his federal case, and that she was prepared to leave him and take the children to Washington, D.C. Police believe that when Ana returned to Cohasset for New Year's, she gave Brian some sort of ultimatum about his federal case coming to a close and told him that she was going to be taking the kids back to Washington with her. And when investigators searched her home in Washington, they found a lot of her son's belongings there, and it looked like she had it set up for them to move in with her. So it's believed that shortly after her friend left their home on New Year's Eve, Brian beat his wife to death and the next day dismembered her in their basement. Brian's defense attorney explained that Brian's mother hired the investigator on her own and that Brian felt it was unnecessary and that Brian had no idea his wife was having an affair until he learned it in the discovery in this case. Prosecutors also noted that financial gain was still likely an element of the motive, especially after they found out that Ana's life insurance policy was worth $2.7 million. And if Ana was going to leave him and take the children, he was going to lose his livelihood because he didn't work. He also made that Google search, how long for someone to be missing to inherit, so that clearly shows that that was on his mind. But his defense attorney says that Brian in no way was in need of money because his mother was very wealthy, but who knows? So I think the motive is pretty clear and the timing makes sense, like with the private investigator and the Google searches and stuff. Something else that came out when police revealed the motive in this murder, and I just thought it was interesting, so I want to mention it here. But they said that just days after Ana was last seen alive, investigators received an email saying, "We have the so-named Ana Walshe with us here. We had a deal worth $127,000. She messed up," which was sent from a Gmail account called Richard Walker 9984. It went on to say, "We have her here with us, and if she doesn't pay the money, then she'll never be back. And we know that the police and FBI are involved. Good luck finding us." Investigators thought that this email was very strange. It was sent to the Cohasset Police Department on January 7th, and they thought it was strange because it didn't list a timeline or contact information to deliver the ransom, which apparently is pretty atypical. They haven't said if they were able to tie this email to Brian Walshe, but I think that's kind of like what they're implying because who else would do that? Brian is set to be back in court at the end of the summer, and it's just such a relief that he is in jail so he can't hurt anyone else, traumatize his children more than he already has, or con anyone else. Of course, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, but I think the evidence here is quite strong. Anyway, guys, that's all I have for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments section below. I'll see you next time, guys. Bye.